Hello everyone, my name is SenGupta and I'm thrilled to welcome you to our webinar today called Export Compliance Best Practices. Now, this is not a 101 course, but I will be covering some basic elements and then jumping into the best practices of export compliance. Now, our agenda for today is the following. Number one, we're going to start with a very quick quiz, but don't worry, you won't be asked to answer any questions. It's just I'll be discussing the answers and you can make a mental note of where your company stands. Number two, what is an export? And all of us know what an export is, but let's look at the Export Administration Regulations definition of what an export is. When do you need an export license? Looking out for red flags. A brief note about penalties. We'll briefly cover the ACE reporting for export information, the electronic export information. And then we'll jump into the new export compliance guidelines issued by the BIS, which is the Bureau of Industry and Security, or the government agency under the Commerce Department tasked with export enforcement. And then finally, we look at export compliance best practices. I'll try to wrap up this presentation to give enough time for questions. So let's get started. And at the end of the presentation, I see many of you already writing chat comments. At the end of the presentation, we'll go through all the comments and all of your questions. Now, a quick quiz. Friends, I've assisted hundreds of companies with export compliance, and I've put together in the next two slides some very high-level questions on export compliance. And usually companies that answer yes to all of these questions have a pretty good program. So let's get started. Number one, do you have an export compliance department? A department could even be one person who's authorized to take export compliance decisions. Number two, do you have an export compliance program? And in the last slide, we'll talk about what an export compliance program is. It's not a software, but it's a system of checks, balances, and processes in your company to deal with exports. Number three, do you have a written compliance manual to address export issues? Number four, are all your ECCN numbers up to date with the latest ECCNs and Schedule Bs for all your products? And I'm delighted to say most of my clients, such as yourselves as well, can answer yes to the next question, which is, do you receive annual training? And that's why you're here. So you can give yourself a pat on the back. The quiz continues in the next slide. How do you ensure you do not ship to prohibited destinations or restricted customers or end users? What checks do you have in place? Number seven, do you perform internal audits frequently? Because human errors are very common and happen all the time. And for that reason, point number 8 says, do you review on a post-filing basis all the export documents you submit? And to just check that you didn't put Schedule B instead of your tax ID number, or something like that. Number 9, if you were to find any errors or discrepancies, do you report it to the government? Or do you just hope that they won't find it? And number 10, are you confident that your company can withstand an export enforcement audit? Friends, obviously, if any of these are no's in your company, then you know which areas you need to fix. The benefits of compliance now, just by way of introduction, those of you who haven't read my bio, For the last dozen years, I was with FedEx, where I managed and co-founded their international trade consulting group. And we would see, obviously, millions of packages during Christmas time, but the packages that got held up were usually the non-compliant packages or shipments, which didn't have some necessary information, or the information was not consistent across the board. So what I tell all my customers is compliance actually saves you money. Compliance ensures that there's no delays, your products aren't held up in customs or caged in the FedEx vernacular, or finally, you don't receive any avoidable penalties for export violations. So that's why I'm a huge fan of compliance. Now let's jump into the next section, which is what is an export? Now, all of us know the first category, which is an actual shipment out of the United States to a foreign destination. But the EAR, which stands for the Export Administration Regulations, says an export is a lot more under the Export Administration Regulations. Not only does it cover any physical product being exported, it also covers intangibles, software, technology contained in emails, right? So it's hardware and software. Software, obviously, you can't see, but it's intellectual property and knowledge, which is also controlled by the export controls. Again, the other definition of export also includes re-exports. That means if you ship a product from here to Canada, but there's no controls, but you ship it from Canada to another country, such it used to be Cuba, but now that's okay, or Iran or Syria, remember that the second leg of the transaction, which is the re-export, is also covered under US export control rules. And finally, deemed exports, where you make your controlled technology available to a foreign national. The next slide, and I must apologize in advance, I have a lot of slides, but the purpose was to provide you with a lot of information, rather than, err on the side of having too little information. Deemed export really means where you're releasing controlled technology to a foreign person within the United States. What's important to note is that it's not every foreign person that is covered. It's only foreign persons from those countries which, if you actually try to make a physical export, you would need an export license. So if you make the same technology available to those countries' citizens in the United States, then that's a deemed export, and you need a deemed export license from the government, which is granted in over 95% of the cases. It usually covers foreign nationals who are brilliant scientists and engineers who came to the US for grad school, and they're working on a very sensitive project. For example, let's take the example of Iran. Suppose there's a jet propulsion project, but that brilliant PhD student is working on the project. You would need a deemed export license for that Iranian national, because the export of that item to Iran is controlled and would need a license. And also remember that this only covers, foreign citizens, including, people on a US student visa or an H-1B employment visa. It does not apply to US citizens or even green card holders, which are permanent residents, and protected individuals, who are on an asylum status. The agencies that regulate export are many, and there's many agencies that have rules covering exports, but the primary one is the Bureau of Industry and Security. When you deal with foreign embargoes, like an embargo to what used to be an embargo to Cuba or Myanmar, which are no longer in effect, but also an embargo to Iran or Syria or Crimea, then the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control is the main agency. And if you deal with any items on the US munitions list, then the State Department's Directorate of Defense Trade Controls is relevant. Now, I also say US Census at the bottom, and they deal with export trade statistics. So they manage the whole Schedule B numbers and all your export filings, such as the electronic export information, which used to be known for us old timers as the shipper's export declaration. And that agency, while they collect the data, their rules are enforced by US Customs. So those are the agencies to the left. And the agencies to the right, they all have some sort of export rules as well. The Bureau of Industry and Securities, which, as I mentioned before, monitors and enforces export controls, their main mission is to keep the most sensitive goods out of the most dangerous hands. Many years ago, before 2002, the name of this agency was BXA, Bureau of Export Enforcement Administration, sorry. But after 9/11 and the war in Iraq, and we'd see a lot of roadside bombs, these improvised explosive devices, which the investigators would go and see it's made in the USA. So there were obviously some illegal exports. So they changed the name to Bureau of Industry and Security, since that better defines its purpose. The main focus of the Bureau of Industry and Security is really to prevent weapons of mass destruction being made by unfriendly regimes around the world and state sponsors of terrorism. But they also try to prevent diversion for unauthorized military use by foreign governments. And the governments, the Bureau of Industry and Security will tell you that the top 3 areas around the world they're most concerned about is China, Iran, and Russia. And they'll tell you that they're obviously not focused as much as direct exports to these countries, which obviously in the case of Iran is banned, but they're more focused on transshipment, where people try to insidiously send product to another country, which is then routed to these 3 destinations. Now, the Bureau of Industry and Security deals with a type of goods called dual-use items. Now, perfectly civilian goods are, furniture, my daughter's dolls, toys, crockery, that's purely civilian use. And we know what is purely military use, right? Grenades, handheld propellers, but there's a huge category, which the government says is about 2% of all exports, which is called dual-use items. And that is what the Bureau of Industry and Security monitors. Dual use stands for items that were designed for a civilian use, but they may also be used for bad purposes like making weapons or anti-terrorism. And these are some of the examples. Now, a high-speed thermal camera, it has a perfectly civilian use, but it can also be made for nuclear weapons, as can be centrifuges. There's a lot of labs that deal with biologics and toxins and bacterial strains. And guess what? These can also be used for making chemical and biological weapons. So right down on the slide, we talk about aluminum alloys and nanomaterials. And you know what? All these composites of the latest, lightest, strongest materials have a wonderful real-world application but they can also be used for missiles. So this is what the Bureau of Industry and Security monitors. And there's a huge group called the Office of Export Enforcement, and they are the federal agents that monitor and enforce and make arrests and do investigations for export violations. So let's jump into the main question of how do you know you need an export license? Well, the government's made it really simple. Sorry, that was a bad joke. I meant this is a labyrinth that we need to go through. But the first question you need to ask is this item subject to the EAR? And actually, let me try to simplify this whole process, which starts with the red arrow on the left and goes all the way to the right, which says submit a license application. So I'm simplifying it on the next slide, which just asks 4 simple questions. Number 1, do you have the correct ECCN number for your product? Number 2, have you checked the general prohibitions that you can't ship to a denied person, embargoed country, prohibited end use, so on and so forth? Step 3, does the country you want to ship to have a X in the box for in the country chart? And I'll go over this in a little more detail. And finally, in case there's an X in the box and it says you need a license to go to that country, let's call it Honduras, is there any license exceptions available for your export? So these are broadly the 4 main questions that simplifies this confusing flowchart. So the first, let me just tell you that the Commerce Control List is a list of control technology. It's a big document, but it's divided into 10 product categories. So if your product is electronics or semiconductors, you'd go to category 3. If you're dealing with aircraft parts, you'd go to category 7. If you're dealing with medical lasers, you'd go to category 6, right? And within each of these categories, this is what the structure looks like. So under electronics, it starts with category 3, but then you have something that's called A, B, C, D, and E. And that stands for whether it's equipment or whether it's test equipment, materials, software, or technology. And that determines whether it's A, B, C, D, or E. And then the Commerce Control List for your product would have many ECCN numbers listed, which stands for Export Control Classification Number. And you know what? If your technology is not listed, it's good news because you fall then under the ECCN number of EAR 99, which means your item is not controlled. So this is how to find your ECCN number. Number 1, check with the OEM, the manufacturer. Chances are very likely that they know the ECCN if they've exported it before. If you're making this product, please deal with the technical team, the people who know the technology inside out. They're the R&D folks or the engineering folks or the scientists, and go over the entire CCL, Commerce Control List, with them, and they can highlight which technology, if at all, is controlled that is applicable in your product. And if there's any ambiguity, the last option I would recommend is to go to the SNAP-R, where you can, ask the government for a determination of the correct ECCN number. The step 2 that I mentioned was there's certain general prohibitions. Whether or not your product has an ECCN or is EAR 99, it may still need a license if you ship to any prohibited end users, embargo destinations, and so forth. And you know, the last line is very important. It says you are prohibited to proceed if a knowledge violation occurs. What that means is if you're shipping to your customer in Mexico and the product's okay, and it's just aluminum rods, but you know that they are going to ship it around the world to Syria where there's an embargo. If you know what they were going to do, you still haven't knowledge to prohibit and prevent that transaction. And if that transaction were to go through, you would be liable for a knowledge violation. Therefore, it's very important not to self-blind yourself. There's also a list called the Consolidated Screening List on the BIS website, which gives you all the folks under different government agencies that you cannot do business with, such as the denied persons list, unverified list, entity list, so on. And the consolidated screening list is one huge CSV file, which you should either download if you don't have this software already. There are many softwares out there, third-party softwares that do the screening for you against your customer or sales database. I'd only recommend that if you do multiple exports a day, right, where it's not possible to do it manually. Moving on to the next slide. Seems a little stuck, sorry. Sorry, I'm just a little stuck. Okay. Oops. So once you know your ECCN, at the bottom of the ECCN, there'd be something called reason for control. And then you've got to use that reason for control. And for example, over here, these are airborne altimeters. And at the bottom, it would say the reason for control is NS, which is National Security, MT, Missile Technology, or AT, which is Anti-Terrorism. And then when you, these are the other possible reasons for control, and they're two-digit abbreviation. And then when you go to the country chart, which is in the regulations, you will see that, for example, suppose your item was, it was tasers. A taser is controlled under the reason for control CC, which is crime control. Some undemocratic governments around the world like to buy tasers, but we don't want those undemocratic dictatorships to have tasers, right, to subjugate their populations. So if you've seen, under Honduras and Hong Kong, there's a X in the box, but there's no X in the box for Hungary and Iceland. So you can ship to Hungary and Iceland, no problem, but because there's an X in the box for Honduras, you would need to apply for a license unless step 4 provides a license exception. And there are several license exceptions, and these are usually listed under the ECCN number for your product. And if there is no license exception, then you need to submit an export license on the online tool called SnapR. SnapR is a great tool. It's, first-timers think it's complex, but once you figure it out, you can use the same template again and again for most of the questions. And you can request snap determinations for up to 6 items at one time. And usually, the BIS licensing team gets back to you within 30 days. So they're very quick, and they've really sped up the process. Before I move on, let me just talk about record keeping. Under the export rules, there's a record keeping requirement for 5 years for all relevant documents for the transaction. It's not just your export filing or your commercial invoice, but the government, if they ever do an investigation, they may ask you for your sales contract, any other financial records or correspondence, purchase order. So it is a very exhaustive list of what they could ask you for. And there's a 5-year record keeping requirement. What the government says is to look out for red flags, because they believe even the best of companies and the most well-run of companies, such as yourselves, they could have violations for the following reasons. It's quarter end and you're being asked to ship product out of the door. What if you go on holiday, or you win the lottery and there's a new personnel who needs the training? Lack of communication between the sales staff and foreign distributors. I'm a huge fan of our friends in sales, but there's a long history of where sales folks can actually cause the export violation in their enthusiastic exuberance to open new foreign destinations and markets. Absence of a EMCP, which the government just calls EMP now, which is an export management, ECP, an export compliance program. The government also tells you to look out for red flags. Every time you're taking a new order, or your customer service or sales is talking to somebody, if it doesn't sound right or read right, try to stop, escalate, research, and possibly refrain from the transaction if it seems, kind of too good to be true, or something's a little weird. And some examples of companies who've had problems includes the following examples. What if the buyer is from a totally different business from your product's capabilities? What if they are tight-lipped about the end use of the product? I won't read through this, but whenever there's a freight forwarder or another agent listed at the final destination, it's like, where is it really going? Obviously, the last bullet here, willing to pay cash up front, is a huge red flag. What I'd like to do is to tell you about penalties. Now, when President Bush the second, sorry, is it 43? was President 43 was the president. Around that time, he signed an executive order increasing the penalties for export violations to what it is now. At that time, the penalties was just 50,000 per violation, but almost overnight it became $250,000 per violation. So I just want to let you know that of all the government agencies I'm scared of for my customers, the export enforcement folks are the scariest, because they can really shut down your business with staggering penalties. And if the criminal penalties and the civil penalties aren't bad enough, number 3 is where they could deny your export privileges for a period of years, or they could even say, denying your export privileges to China or Russia or any particular country. So this is why upper management really needs to be aware of these risks. And, I'm delighted y'all are joining us today. Another change last year, those of you remember filing the paper copy of the shipper's export declaration. That's where you need to write your Schedule B number, which looks just like your HTS number. And the purpose of that is for the Bureau of the Census, which is under the Commerce Department, to collect trade statistics. Well, what's happened is since 2008, they made that shipper's export declaration electronic. And it was then called the Electronic Export Information, which you needed to file on what's known as the AES system, the Automated Export System. Now, 3 years ago, President Obama signed an executive order for facilitating export and import through a common window, and he mandated to all the government agencies that there should be one IT platform for imports and exports and data. So US Customs was appointed as the nodal agency, and they used the ACE platform, or the Automated Commercial Environment, as this single window for all the government agencies. So now you as an exporter are required to submit your electronic export information, the EEI, on the Automated Commercial Environment. It's a very straightforward process. Again, first time around, there's a little bit of training that might be needed for your personnel. Now, let me talk about when do you need to file an EEI, because there's a little bit of confusion. Number one, if your product needs an export license, then whatever the value and wherever the destination, you need to file an EEI. Similarly, if your product is subject to ITAR, which is International Traffic in Arms Regulations, you need to file an EEI regardless of value or destination. But for all other products, you only need to submit an EEI if it's more than $2,500 per Schedule B number. That means if you have 5, let me give you an example, smartphones, and each smartphone is $500, then, once it crosses $2,500 in that shipment, you would then need to file an EEI. And you do not need to file an EEI for shipments to Canada, unless, of course, it needs an export license. And neither do you need to file it for certain American possessions like Guam, American Samoa, and so on. Now, the foreign trade regulations also has many other exceptions, and these exceptions could deal with software, intangibles, so on and so forth. So if you need any further clarification, I'm delighted to help. And they also introduced penalties to this whole EEI filing, which was a new development because they never had penalties being enforced earlier, but now these penalties are administered by customs. Friends, it's time to talk about the new export compliance guidelines that have just been announced by the BIS, literally less than 2 months ago. What the government did is, originally they had an excellent compliance guidelines on their website, but with time, as time went by, they updated it. They used to call it the Export Management Compliance Program, EMCP guidelines, and now they've dropped the M. It's just Export Compliance Program guidelines. It's what the government recommends to you to have better and tighter controls over your export process. What they say is that having an export compliance program really helps keep your management out of prison, fines, promotes a best practices business environment, assigns roles and responsibilities and tasks to different people in your entire life cycle of your order and different departments. And finally, and this is what I like, God forbid if there's ever an export violation and they come to give you a penalty, having a written export compliance program is a mitigating factor in them assigning, the government assigning penalties to you. So it's that, hey, at least you did it, but something fell through the cracks, but you made a good faith effort. So those of you who are actively into exporting, please consider export compliance program. Now, the export compliance program has 8 main elements, and I'm going to talk about each of these elements briefly. Number 1 is management commitment. Now, what the government says is it all starts from the top. And it's very difficult, and they recognize for mid-level or entry-level compliance folks to get anything done without management commitment. I've got a customer who, I'm sorry to say, but management was all about saving money, cutting costs, and compliance went by the wayside, and that demoralized the compliance team. So what the government would like to see is some evidence that upper management supports the compliance program. They would love to see a written statement from management that says how compliance is important, how management wants to support, giving resources and time and people, and also saying that the company will not tolerate violations or any non-compliant activity. The second major pillar in this 8-pillar export compliance program is doing a risk assessment. And a risk assessment really is figuring out your entire business process. Every time, ever since a customer comes to you for an order and you're logging in that order, you're signing the company on as a new business, new customer, all the way to product fulfillment, R&D, and shipping the product out the door, you need to identify all the possible risks of export violations that can happen. For example, when you first bring in a client, have you done a denied party screening? When you're doing the R&D and developing the product, are you ensuring that there's no deemed export violations with foreign nationals for controlled technology? Do you know what the ECCN is? As soon as you develop the product at the new product initiation stage, rather than all the way at the end of the process when you're shipping the product out and you figure out, hey, what's the ECCN, right? Again, when you're selling the product, do you know which countries you should not ship to? And when you're bringing on distributors and resellers, do you train them on which countries they can't ship to? So this is all part of the risk assessment. The next section is a very important operational section that deals with export authorization. Over here, once you figure out the ECCN number, determine who has jurisdiction. Is it a State Department controlled item under international traffic in arms, or is it a Commerce Department, which over 95% of items are? And if you need a license, apply for the license and do a proper screening of all your customers, distributors, vendors against the consolidated list. Number 4 is record keeping. The government is a very big proponent of moving to electronic records as long as they're a proper replica of the original and they're easily retrievable. Also, in any company, it's not possible for one person to have all the records. For example, shipping, receiving keeps some records of shipment. Finance keeps records of payments. And then, the compliance team keeps records of everything else, like license applications. So assign roles and responsibilities of who keeps what records and have some sort of system of linking everything together. So in case you need different documents for any particular transaction, you can find it. Again, I'm delighted that all of you are attending your training. Training should not just stop with the compliance people. I tell all my customers that try to create an international trade council within your company, which is an interdepartmental group that meets as needed. It could be at least once every 3 months, once a quarter. And over there, there's representatives from finance, tax, customer service, operations, R&D, shipping, receiving, legal, and compliance. And you'll discuss any major international trade issues that might have come up and have a comprehensive solution. What this does is it doesn't just make international import-export compliance your responsibility, but it shares the knowledge and burden and interest among other stakeholders as well. So in training, I also am a big proponent of the trainers training other folks based on the department. For instance, purchasing folks need different kind of training from the salespeople, who need different kind of training from sales administration, and definitely the engineers, they need a whole different set of training because they're they're wired slightly differently. Number 6, the government is a huge proponent and fan of audits. Whenever they see an audit in a company, it gives them some level of comfort that you've got good, tight internal controls in place. And what they want to see is, ideally, they don't want to see you auditing your own shipments, because that's like the fox guarding the henhouse. It'll be great if there's another affiliated department, such as finance or quality or audit, who takes a random sampling of your export transactions and goes through a checklist and audits a set of entries or export shipments. Number 7, I didn't talk about voluntary disclosures. This is a system where the government allows you to confess, or before they find out, let them know that there was an error that you uncovered. And if you ever uncover an export violation, obviously the first thing to do is to inform senior management and your legal counsel, because the dollar value of these potential penalties is so high. The first thing you should do is to obviously involve your legal counsel, take a business decision. I'm always in favor of disclosing to the government, but it obviously all depends upon the violation in question. But please consider the voluntary disclosure. Number 8, building your export compliance manual. Now, what the government says is, although this is listed as number 8, they say companies that don't have an export compliance manual, they should start with this, because it's very important. It's like your GPS, which prevents your company from getting lost along the whole maze of export rules. Friends, what I'm going to do is to tell you about some best practices for export compliance that I've seen. And this list of, I think it's about 14 best practices, comes from dealing with literally numerous companies and seeing what they have in place. So number 1, nothing can substitute a formal statement of management policy. And you will see how this ties in to the 8 elements that the government wants in your export compliance plan, right? This was number 1 there as well. Number 2, I see many companies who have appointed somebody else from administration or sales or operations, and they say, hey, guess what? You're the new export compliance person. While I think anybody can be trained, export compliance is a little technical. So please ensure you give that person all the training and support and education they need on complicated export regulations. Because all too often I see companies where the export compliance person needs a lot more training. Number 3, it's very important to flow chart your entire order process and identify contacts in each department for export compliance. There could be an export compliance lead in shipping receiving, in the legal team, within sales, right? Number 4, as I mentioned before, having a written manual is not just what the government wants, but having these written easy to understand work instructions is critical. I hate to give Pricewaterhouse a hard time, but as we see what happened in the Oscars in the little mix-up, apparently they did have a process if they gave the wrong envelope to the Oscar winners. But even that remedial process was not followed, right? So I'm just saying that, you know, having an escalation procedure, having documented procedures is really a good thing. Otherwise, you know, anything could happen. On number 5, I highly recommend updating your product database with the correct ECCN number and Schedule B and HTS, but definitely, given the context of today's webinar, definitely the ECCN number. And if many of you have done it several years ago, and you know, when Bob was the warehouse manager, you know, it's really time to update it. I would say at least every 3 years, because the ECCN structure in the Commerce Control List may have changed, or if you're into high tech, your product itself may have changed. So not just the rules, but your product as well. So always update your ECCN every 3 years. And whenever you're in doubt, point number 6 says, you're a taxpayer and your taxpayer dollars are financing the government, so feel free to ask them for a snap-hour ruling. And the reason I talked about being a taxpayer is the government will always tell you, oh, in many instances, you know, that's really straightforward, it's EAR 99. But if you're not convinced, I always recommend to get a written snap-hour determination, so that if there's ever an export enforcement knocking on your door, you can show them that snap-hour document. Having effective restricted party screening is very important. If you just ship a couple of packages a day or a week, you can do it manually, checking the name of that individual or company against the consolidated screening list. But obviously, if you're shipping a lot more than that, you may need to consider a third-party software. And there's many software out there. I'll just put a plug. I don't get compensated for this, but you know, FedEx.com has a free tool where you can type in the name of the individual and it'll show if it's a denied party check or not, if there's been a match. Record keeping in electronic form, I'm a huge proponent of this. As I said, try to link all your electronic procedures with some common reference points, such as the invoice number or the PO number, so it can all be tracked together. Number 9 talks about developing a vendor compliance program. And this deals not just with your foreign vendors, but also distributors and resellers. A couple of years ago, there was a company called, did I just forget the name of the company? I thought it was Blue Note. Oh, well, sorry, I'm just forgetting the name. It was a Silicon Valley and San Francisco company that has just been bought out by Symantec. And what they had is they had a distributor in Saudi Arabia who said, yeah, you know, we'll take your product and, you know, we're going to ship it to another country in the Middle East. And they gave some name, but they ended up falsifying the documents and shipping it to Syria. So Syria was an embargoed nation, but the government gave a $1 million penalty to the foreign distributor, but not to the US company, because they did have a good formal distributor training program, but the foreign distributor chose to ignore and be dishonest. Having a good training program, again, is number 10, and this helps not just you, but your sales team, your order processing team, the finance team, and other departments. Again, I'm almost 10 minutes away, so I'm just going to go quickly through the rest. Having a system of formalized audits. You don't need to bring in a consultant, so you can do it in-house. Although, I recommend every couple of years, it's also good to have an outside pair of eyes view it. Finally, all the red flags I mentioned, keep an eye out for anything that's suspicious and possibly refrain from the transaction if it's too good to be true. Friends, with that, I'd love to take any questions you may have.